The folder fell from my trembling hands, paper scattering across the mahogany conference table like autumn leaves. One single line buried in paragraph 17 would expose a betrayal so deep. It would shatter everything I thought I knew about my late husband's final wishes. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the moment I discovered that death doesn't always end deception. Sometimes it just begins it. I'm Margaret, 48, and for 12 years I believed I had mastered the art of being the perfect stepmother. When I married David Chen at 36, I inherited not just a husband, but also his two teenage children, Emma and Lucas, from his first marriage. Their mother, Catherine, had died in a car accident 3 years prior, leaving David to navigate single parenthood while building his architectural firm from the ground up. The kids were 14 and 16 when we married, old enough to remember their mother vividly, young enough to need guidance through their grief. I approached my role with the careful precision of someone who understood I was walking into a minefield of emotions, loyalties, and unspoken expectations. I never tried to replace Catherine. Her photos remain throughout David's our house. I encouraged the children to talk about her, to maintain traditions she had started, and to visit her grave on important dates. When Emma struggled with calculus, I found her a tutor rather than trying to help myself, knowing she needed space to be vulnerable, without feeling like she was betraying her mother's memory. When Lucas got into trouble at school, I supported David's disciplinary decisions without inserting my own opinions, even when I privately disagreed. My background in social work had taught me about blended family dynamics, but theory and practice proved vastly different. Every decision required careful navigation. Should I attend parent-teacher conferences? Would my presence at Emma's volleyball games feel intrusive? How could I show care without overstepping invisible boundaries? David appreciated my thoughtful approach. "You're exactly what this family needed," he would tell me during our quiet moments together. Patient, understanding, giving us all time to heal. His gratitude felt like validation that my careful choreography was working. The children's adjustment varied. Emma, naturally more reserved, took longer to warm up to me. She was polite but distant for the first 2 years, measuring every interaction against memories of her mother. Lucas, younger and more adaptable, began including me in his world sooner. He started asking my opinion on college applications, sharing stories about his friends, and even occasionally giving me awkward teenage hugs. By year 5 of our marriage, we had established our own rhythm. Family dinners where everyone actually talked, vacation planning that considered everyone's preferences, holiday traditions that honored the past while creating new memories. I genuinely believed we had built something beautiful from the foundation of loss. David's architectural practice flourished during our marriage years. His innovative designs for sustainable housing developments earned national recognition. We moved to a larger home, traveled internationally, and began discussing retirement plans. The financial stress of his early widowerhood had lifted, replaced by the security of success and stable family life. What I didn't realize was how differently David and his children perceived my role in their lives. To me, we were family imperfect but genuine, built on mutual respect and growing love. To them, I was learning much later, I was still fundamentally an outsider. Someone who had provided necessary stability during a difficult period, but not someone with a permanent claim to their inner circle. The signs were subtle, visible only in retrospect. Private jokes between David and the children that excluded me. Family stories that stopped mid-sentence when I entered the room. Financial discussions that happened when I wasn't present. I attributed these moments to natural family dynamics, not deliberate exclusion. My own background contributed to this misreading. Growing up in foster care, I had learned to adapt to existing family structures rather than expecting to shape them. I was comfortable being helpful without being central and supportive, without being essential. This adaptability, which had served me well in my social work career, also made me miss the warning signs of my peripheral position in my own family. The children went off to college with my enthusiastic support. Emma studied environmental law at Berkeley. Lucas pursued engineering at MIT. I felt maternal pride in their achievements, helped with application essays, and celebrated their acceptances as enthusiastically as any parent would. David and I began discussing how we would reinvent our relationship as empty nesters. Looking back, I realized those years of believing I belonged, of thinking we had successfully blended our family, of imagining I had earned permanent inclusion, those were perhaps the happiest years of my adult life. I had finally found what I thought was forever home. The irony is that the very qualities that made me a good stepmother, selflessness, adaptability, putting others' needs before my own, also made me vulnerable to the deception. that was building around me. I was so focused on maintaining family harmony that I never questioned whether that harmony was authentic or performative. David's heart attack came without warning on a Tuesday morning in October. He was reviewing blueprints in his home office when I heard a crash from the next room. By the time paramedics arrived, he was gone. 59 years old, perfect health, regular exercise, no family history of heart disease. Sometimes life simply stops mid-sentence. The immediate aftermath of death has its own cruel rhythm. Phone calls to make, arrangements to coordinate, and decisions that feel impossible when you can barely remember to breathe. Emma flew in from San Francisco, and Lucas from Boston. The three of us moved through the funeral preparations with mechanical efficiency, grief temporarily suspended by necessity. During those first few days, I felt genuinely supported by David's children. Emma handled the memorial service logistics with her typical thoroughness. Lucas managed the flood of condolences and flower deliveries. We took turns fielding calls from David's business associates, clients, and extended family. In our shared loss, I felt our family bond solidifying. The funeral itself was beautiful, if any funeral can be called that. David's architectural colleagues spoke about his innovative vision and environmental consciousness. Emma delivered a eulogy that captured her father's dedication to both family and craft. Lucas read a poem their mother had loved, bringing past and present together in a moment of healing symmetry. Standing at the graveside, I felt the weight of becoming the keeper of David's memory for our family. As his widow, I would be the one to preserve his stories, maintain relationships with his friends, and ensure his values continued to influence Emma and Lucas as they built their own adult lives. The responsibility felt both overwhelming and sacred. What struck me during the reception was how naturally people treated me as David's primary survivor. Business associates discussed outstanding projects with me. Family friends shared condolences that acknowledged my central role in David's life. Even David's elderly parents, who had initially been skeptical of his remarriage, seemed to view me as the natural person to handle his affairs. The children appeared to accept this arrangement. Emma asked me to coordinate with David's business partner about winding down his practice. Lucas requested that I handle the insurance claims and financial paperwork. Their confidence in my judgment felt like final acceptance into the family's inner circle. 2 weeks after the funeral, we met at David's lawyer's office for the will reading. I expected a straightforward document dividing assets between his children and me, probably favoring them given the natural priority of biological family. I had no financial concerns. My social work pension, our joint savings, and David's life insurance would provide comfortable security. James Morrison had been David's lawyer for over 15 years, handling everything from his first wife's estate to business contracts to our prenuptial agreement. A man in his 60s with silver hair and careful manners, he had always treated me with professional courtesy during the few occasions we had met. The initial will reading proceeded predictably. David's architectural firm would be dissolved, with ongoing projects transferred to his business partner. The house and primary assets were split between Emma, Lucas, and me, with slightly larger portions going to the children. His retirement accounts, built up significantly during our marriage, were divided equally among the three of us. But then Morrison pulled out a second document, this one bearing a more recent date. "Your father prepared an updated will 6 months ago," he explained to Emma and Lucas, his tone carefully neutral. "This supersedes the previous version and contains some modifications to the original distributions." My stomach dropped before I even understood why. There was something in Morrison's voice, a careful distance that hadn't been there moments earlier when discussing the first will. Emma and Lucas exchanged a glance that lasted perhaps 2 seconds too long, suggesting they weren't entirely surprised by this development. The second will contained significant changes. While I would retain rights to live in our home for 2 years, ownership would then transfer entirely to Emma and Lucas. David's life insurance, which I had assumed would provide my primary financial security, now went directly to his children. Most shocking, assets I had considered our savings accounts built during our marriage, investment properties we had purchased together, were designated solely for Emma and Lucas. Under the terms of this second will, I would receive a modest settlement, enough for basic living expenses, but nowhere near what I would need to maintain the lifestyle David and I had built together. After 12 years of marriage, I was being provided for like a valued employee receiving severance pay, rather than a widow inheriting from her husband. Morrison explained these changes with clinical precision, occasionally glancing at Emma and Lucas for reactions they didn't provide. When he finished, silence filled the mahogany-paneled office like toxic gas outside. Seattle rain tapped against tall windows, the only sound acknowledging the earthquake that had just reshaped my understanding of my marriage. "I know this comes as a surprise," Emma finally said, her voice gentle but firm. "Dad was worried about leaving us with too much responsibility for managing complex finances. This arrangement ensures everyone's security while giving Lucas and me clear inheritance rights." The explanation felt rehearsed, as if she had practiced delivering it with compassion while maintaining necessary emotional distance. Lucas nodded along, his engineering mind probably appreciating the logical distribution of assets even as his heart might have recognized the cruelty. I left Morrison's office in a fog of disbelief, clutching copies of the wills like evidence of my own naive stupidity. How had I missed the signs that David was planning to reduce me to the status of temporary caretaker? When had he made this decision? And why had he never discussed it with me? The drive home felt surreal. Streets I had navigated for 12 years looked unfamiliar. The house that had been our sanctuary now felt like borrowed space with an expiration date. I sat in the driveway for 20 minutes, staring at the front door David and I had painted blue together 3 summers ago, trying to reconcile the man who had chosen that color with me with the man who had written me out of our shared future. Inside, everything looked exactly the same but felt completely different. The kitchen is where I had prepared thousands of meals for our family. The living room where we had hosted Emma's graduation party, and Lucas's friends for countless sleepovers. The master bedroom was where David and I had talked about growing old together. All of it is now revealed as temporary arrangements rather than a permanent home. That night, I called my sister Rachel, my only remaining biological family. She listened to the will reading recap with increasing outrage. 12 years of marriage, and he leaves you essentially nothing. After everything you did for those kids? There has to be something wrong with this picture, Margaret. Rachel's anger felt validating but also somehow beside the point. The legal documents were clear. David's signature was authentic. Whatever his motivations, his intentions were unambiguous. I had been married to someone who saw our relationship differently than I did, and now I was paying the price for that misunderstanding. The following weeks passed in administrative limbo. Emma and Lucas returned to their respective cities, promising to stay in touch about transition logistics. I began the grim process of inventorying a life I would soon need to dismantle. Which furniture belonged to me versus David? Which memories could I keep versus which belonged to his children? The isolation was crushing. Friends from our married life didn't know how to navigate the awkwardness of divided loyalties. David's business associates expressed sympathy but gradually stopped calling. Even my own colleagues seemed unsure whether to treat me as a grieving widow or simply someone whose living situation was about to change. 3 weeks after the will reading, I was boxing up David's office when I found his copy of the documents Morrison had distributed. Curiosity, or maybe masochism, drove me to read through them again, looking for clues about his decision-making process. That's when I noticed something odd. The second will, the one that had drastically reduced my inheritance, was dated 6 months before David's death, but attached to it was a letter of instruction to Morrison dated just 2 months prior. The letter contained specific guidance about how to handle the will reading, including the exact phrasing Morrison should use when explaining the changes to me. More disturbing was a handwritten note in David's writing: "Ensure Margaret understands. This is final. No challenges, no negotiations. The children's future security is paramount." The coldness of those words, written in his familiar handwriting, felt like a physical blow. But it was the next document that stopped my breath entirely. Buried in the stack was a preliminary draft of the second will, heavily marked with red corrections in David's hand. This version had been even harsher, leaving me only enough money to relocate and establish basic housing elsewhere. Someone David presumably had crossed out those sections and written in the margins to severe must appear reasonable. The implication was chilling. David hadn't been struggling with how to provide fairly for both his children and his wife. He had been calculating exactly how little he could leave me while avoiding the appearance of outright cruelty. This wasn't family financial planning. This was strategic disinheritance with careful attention to optics. As I continued reading, I found email printouts between David and Morrison discussing the Margaret situation. The clinical tone of their correspondence reduced our 12-year marriage to a problem requiring a legal solution. Morrison's advice: focus on minimizing the likelihood of a successful challenge while maintaining plausible deniability about David's motivations. One email from Morrison particularly stung. "We need to be careful that the distribution appears thoughtful rather than punitive. Margaret has been a stabilizing presence for the family, but your primary obligation is to your biological children. The key is structuring this in a way that looks like prudent planning, rather than deliberate exclusion." David's response was equally cold. "Agreed. Margaret will be hurt, but she's resilient. The children's inheritance is what matters long-term. She can rebuild. They can't get back what we give away." Reading my husband's assessment of my resilience, his casual dismissal of my financial security, and his reduction of our marriage to an obstacle to his children's wealth, it felt like discovering he had been leading a double life I had never suspected. I spent the next 2 days in a state of numb shock, rereading the documents and trying to process the systematic deception they revealed. The man I had loved and trusted had been planning my financial abandonment for months, possibly years, while maintaining the facade of our partnership. On Thursday morning, I called Morrison's office to schedule an appointment. I told his secretary I had questions about probate procedures and estate tax implications, technical concerns that wouldn't raise suspicions about my true purpose. Morrison received me in his office with professional sympathy that now felt patronizing, rather than comforting. "I know this transition period is difficult, Margaret. David's wishes may seem harsh, but he truly believed this arrangement served everyone's best interests." The casual assumption that I would accept his interpretation without question irritated me. "I'm trying to understand the timing of his decisions," I replied carefully. "The second will was dated 6 months ago, but some of these assets were accumulated much more recently. I'm concerned about potential tax implications." Morrison nodded, pulling out a thick file folder. David was very thorough in his planning. He wanted to ensure everything was properly structured for maximum benefit to his beneficiaries. He began explaining estate tax calculations with the confidence of someone who assumed I lacked the knowledge to question his assertions. As he talked, I watched him flip through documents, occasionally stopping to reference specific sections. His familiarity with the file was obvious. This wasn't the first time he had reviewed these materials. The planning for my disinheritance had been extensive and careful. Now, regarding the life insurance policies, Morrison continued. David restructured those beneficiary designations specifically to avoid probate complications. Very smart planning on his part. He pulled out a document I recognized as David's insurance paperwork. But something was wrong with the paper he was showing me. The beneficiary change form was dated 8 months ago, not 6 months like the will. If David had been planning these changes for 8 months, why had he waited 2 additional months to update his will? "I'm confused about the sequence of these changes," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "The insurance beneficiary changes predate the will modifications by several months." Morrison's confident expression flickered briefly. He flipped back through the file, checking dates with less certainty than he had shown moments earlier. "Well, estate planning is often an iterative process." David made adjustments as he refined his thinking. The explanation was reasonable, but his momentary uncertainty suggested he hadn't expected me to notice the timing discrepancy. More importantly, it indicated there might be other inconsistencies in the carefully constructed narrative of David's decision-making process. I pressed gently further. "Were there other versions of the will between the original and the final one? I want to make sure I understand his evolving intentions." "No," Morrison replied quickly. "Just the 2 versions you've seen." David was very decisive once he began the revision process, but his eyes had shifted away from mine, and his hands had stilled on the documents in a way that suggested discomfort. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Morrison providing detailed explanations of probate procedures and tax obligations. But I was no longer listening to his words. I was watching his body language, noting the subtle signs of anxiety that appeared whenever I asked questions about timing or decision-making processes. As our meeting concluded, Morrison gathered the documents back into his file folder. But in his haste to organize the papers, several sheets slipped to the floor. I immediately bent to help collect them, my social work instincts to assist kicking in automatically. One of the fallen documents caught my attention, a letter bearing David's letterhead, but not his usual signature. The text was brief, just a few paragraphs, but it was the date that made me pause. This letter was dated just 3 weeks before David's death, well after the supposed final will had been executed. Morrison noticed my hesitation and quickly reached for the paper, but not before I had seen the opening line, regarding the recent modifications to my estate planning documents. "What is this?" I asked, holding the paper just out of his reach. Morrison's professional composure cracked slightly. Oh, that's just some correspondence about administrative details. Nothing that affects the primary distributions. He held out his hand expectantly. But I didn't return the document. The letter was brief, but its contents were explosive. David was writing to Morrison about concerns that the current arrangement may be too harsh, requesting a meeting to discuss potential modifications that would be more equitable to Margaret, while still protecting the children's primary inheritance. The final paragraph was the most damning. I've been reconsidering some of my earlier decisions. Margaret has been more than just a stepmother to Emma and Lucas, and I want to ensure my final wishes reflect their reality. Please prepare revised documentation for our next meeting. The letter was dated October 8th. David had died on October 15th. Morrison's face had gone pale as he realized what I was reading. That letter doesn't represent any finalized decisions, he said quickly. David often reconsidered various options. The executed will represent his final intentions. But I was already understanding the implications. David had been having second thoughts about disinheriting me. He had scheduled a meeting with Morrison to discuss more equitable arrangements. If he had lived just one more week, my entire financial future might have been different. The drive home from Morrison's office felt like traveling through a different universe. In my purse, I carried a photocopy of David's letter that Morrison had reluctantly allowed me to take, after I insisted it was necessary for my understanding of the estate's complexity. What he didn't know was that I had also glimpsed and memorized the header information from another document in his file, correspondence from Emma dated 2 weeks after the funeral. That evening, I sat at David's desk and began methodically reviewing every piece of paper I could find related to his business affairs and financial planning. If David had been reconsidering his estate planning decisions, there might be other evidence of his changing intentions. In his personal filing cabinet, I found appointment calendars going back 3 years. The entries were typical David, meticulous, color-coded, with detailed notes about meetings and follow-up requirements. But as I traced through the months leading up to his death, a disturbing pattern emerged. David's meetings with Morrison had intensified significantly starting 8 months ago, occurring weekly rather than his usual quarterly check-ins. More concerning were notations about separate meetings with Emma and Lucas, individual sessions that had never been mentioned to me. One calendar entry from 7 months ago caught my attention. E&L meeting discuss estate concerns. Another from 6 months ago. Morrison implement family protection plan. And then, 2 months before his death, E&L address M's concerns need a unified approach. The abbreviations weren't difficult to decode. Emma and Lucas had been involved in David's estate planning decisions from the beginning. The changes hadn't been his unilateral decision, they had been collaborative family planning that excluded only one family member, me. My phone rang, interrupting my archaeological excavation of my marriage. Emma's name appeared on the screen. Hi Margaret. I wanted to check how you're doing with everything. I know the transition has been difficult. Her voice carried the careful kindness I had grown accustomed to over the years, but now it sounded calculated rather than genuine. I'm managing, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. Actually, I had some questions about your father's estate planning process. Morrison mentioned there were several meetings before he finalized his decisions. A brief pause. Dad was very thorough about family financial security. He wanted to make sure everyone would be taken care of appropriately. The phrasing was telling, appropriately rather than fairly or equally. It suggested a predetermined hierarchy of who deserved what level of consideration. Were you and Lucas involved in those discussions? I asked directly. Another pause, longer this time. Dad asked for our input about managing inheritance responsibilities. You know how he was about family decision-making. He liked everyone to be informed. Everyone except me, apparently. It would be helpful for me to understand his reasoning, I continued. Some of the timing seems unusual, and I want to make sure I'm not missing important context. Margaret. Emma's voice shifted to a tone I had heard her use with difficult clients during her law internships. I think it's important for everyone to accept Dad's final wishes and focus on moving forward. Analyzing his decision-making process won't change the outcome. The conversation ended with polite promises to stay in touch. But her message was clear: don't look too closely at how we got here. That night, I couldn't sleep. The evidence was pointing toward a conclusion that fundamentally altered my understanding of my family dynamics. David, Emma, and Lucas had apparently collaborated on plans that excluded me from both the decision-making process and the financial benefits of a marriage I had believed was a partnership. The next morning, I called Morrison's office again. This time, I spoke directly to his secretary about scheduling David's final appointment. "I'm sorry," she said, "but Mr. Chen didn't have any future appointments scheduled. His last meeting with Mr. Morrison was in September. Are you certain?" I found a note in David's calendar about a meeting scheduled for the week after he died. A pause while she checked her records. "No, I don't show any appointments for Mr. Chen in October." Mr. Morrison's calendar was completely clear that week. Another lie. Morrison had denied that David was planning any further changes to his estate planning. But David's own calendar suggested otherwise. Someone had canceled that appointment after David's death, before any modifications could be made. I spent the rest of the day calling David's other professional contacts, his accountant, his business partner, and his financial advisor. Each conversation revealed small but significant details about the months leading up to his death. David's accountant confirmed that he had requested detailed financial projections about supporting to separate household information that would be necessary if he was considering providing me with more substantial independent resources. His business partner mentioned that David had asked about the possibility of establishing a consulting agreement that would provide me with ongoing income from the architectural firm after his death. His financial advisor revealed that David had been researching annuity products that would guarantee my financial security for life, expressing concern about leaving me vulnerable to economic uncertainty. Every conversation painted the same picture. David had been actively working on ways to provide better for my future right up until his death. The harsh will Morrison had executed was apparently a preliminary measure, meant to be revised into something more equitable. The most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. David's administrative assistant, who had worked with him for over a decade, called to express her condolences and offer help with any business-related matters I needed to handle. During our conversation, she mentioned something that made my blood run cold. "Mr. Chen was so excited about the surprise he was planning for you. He said the new estate arrangements would ensure you never had to worry about money again, but he wanted to present them to you as an anniversary gift." Our 13th wedding anniversary would have been November 20th, just over a month after David's death. Armed with evidence of David's true intentions, I requested another meeting with Morrison, this time with Emma and Lucas present. I told them I had discovered some discrepancies in the estate documents and needed clarification before I could complete my financial transition planning. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at Morrison's office. When I arrived, Emma and Lucas were already seated at the conference table, their expressions carefully composed but unmistakably wary. Morrison's usual professional warmth was absent, replaced by the guarded demeanor of someone expecting confrontation. I discovered some information that raises questions about David's final intentions. Regarding his estate, I began placing copies of the documents I had found on the table. Specifically, evidence that he was planning significant modifications to his will before his death. Morrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as I explained previously. David often considered various options, but the executed will represents his final decisions. "Actually," I replied, sliding David's letter across the table, "this suggests otherwise. David was planning a meeting with you to revise the will in a way that would be more equitable to me. He died before that meeting could take place." Emma reached for the letter, her lawyer's instincts kicking in as she quickly scanned the contents. Her professional mask slipped momentarily, revealing surprise that looked genuine. Lucas read over her shoulder, his expression shifting from confusion to something approaching concern. "I don't understand," Lucas said quietly. "Dad told us the will was final. He said he had considered all options carefully, and this arrangement was what he wanted." Morrison intervened quickly. "This letter represents preliminary thinking, not final decisions. Estate planning is an iterative process, and clients often reconsider various approaches before settling on their final wishes. But David died before he could complete that process," I pressed. "Which means the will you executed may not reflect his actual final intentions. It might represent an intermediate step in his decision-making, not his concluded wishes." The room fell silent as the implication sank in. If David had been planning to revise the will, and had died before making those revisions, then the document Morrison had executed might not be legally valid as a representation of David's final testamentary intentions. Emma's legal training was clearly working through the possibilities. "What exactly are you suggesting, Margaret?" I'm suggesting that David was having second thoughts about the financial arrangements in his will. He had scheduled a meeting with Morrison to make the estate distribution more equitable. His sudden death prevented those changes from being implemented, but that doesn't mean we should ignore his evolving intentions. Morrison was looking increasingly uncomfortable. The law recognizes executed wills, not hypothetical future changes that were never finalized. David's signed will is legally binding regardless of any subsequent thoughts he might have had. Unless, Emma said slowly, her legal mind engaged despite her personal interests. There's evidence that the executed will doesn't reflect his actual testamentary intent. If Dad was in the process of revising his will when he died, and if we can establish what those revisions would have contained, there might be grounds for a different interpretation. Lucas looked between his sister and me with growing distress. Are you saying Dad didn't actually want to leave things the way they are? That he changed his mind? The question hung in the air, like a challenge to everything we had assumed about David's final wishes. Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly recognizing that the legal ground was becoming less stable. Your father expressed concerns about the current arrangement, I said gently to Lucas, and was actively working on changes that would better reflect his love and respect for all of his family members. The will you inherited from was apparently meant to be temporary. Emma was studying Morrison with the intensity of a prosecutor examining a hostile witness. Mr. Morrison, did you advise my father that the will he signed in April should be considered final? Or did you understand it to be a preliminary version pending further revisions? Morrison's answer would determine the legal viability of David's executed will. If he had advised David that the document was final, then it would stand as David's testamentary intent. If he had understood it to be preliminary, then David's death before completing revisions might invalidate the entire document. Your father, Morrison said carefully, was a methodical man who liked to consider all options before making final decisions. We had discussed the possibility of future refinements, but the April will was fully executed and legally binding. It was a lawyer's answer, technically accurate but deliberately incomplete. Morrison was acknowledging David's intention to make further changes, while maintaining that the executed will was legally valid. But his evasiveness suggested there was more to the story. I pulled out my final piece of evidence, the appointment calendar showing David's planned meeting with Morrison for the week after his death. If the April will was meant to be final, why was David planning another meeting with you specifically to discuss estate modifications? Morrison stared at the calendar entry for a long moment before answering. That meeting was administrative, to address some technical implementation questions. Emma's legal instincts were now fully activated. What kind of technical questions require face-to-face meetings about estate modifications? The room's tension was palpable as Morrison realized he was being systematically cornered by questions he couldn't answer without revealing uncomfortable truths about David's planning process. Morrison's composure finally cracked under Emma's precise questioning. What emerged over the next hour was a story more complex and more painful than I had imagined. David had indeed been collaborating with Emma and Lucas on estate planning, but not in the way I had assumed. Initially, they had all agreed that his assets should be preserved primarily for his biological children, with modest provisions for me. The harsh will Morrison had executed represented that original family consensus. But as David approached his death, though none of them knew it at the time, he had begun questioning whether this arrangement was fair or even ethical. His conversations with his business contacts about providing for me weren't hypothetical planning. They were David's attempt to understand how to restructure his estate to ensure my security without completely abandoning his children's interests. The meeting scheduled for the week after his death was specifically intended to revise the will, to create a more balanced distribution. Morrison had prepared draft language that would have provided me with lifetime financial security, while still leaving the majority of assets to Emma and Lucas. Most crushing of all, Emma and Lucas had not been aware of David's changing intentions. They had believed the April will represented his final decision, arrived at through family consensus. Learning that their father was having second thoughts about disinheriting me was as shocking to them as discovering the original will had been to me. He never said anything about changing his mind, Lucas said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. I thought he was happy with the arrangement. I thought it's what everyone wanted. Emma was staring at the documents spread across the table, with the expression of someone reorganizing fundamental assumptions. Margaret, we genuinely believe this was what Dad wanted. If we had known he was reconsidering. The sentence hung unfinished, but the implication was clear. Had they known David was planning to provide more equitably for me, they might have supported those changes rather than feeling like they were honoring his wishes by maintaining the harsh provisions. Morrison's role in this tragedy was perhaps the most complicated. As David's lawyer, he had been obligated to execute the will David had signed, regardless of any subsequent discussions about modifications. But his failure to inform Emma and Lucas about David's evolving intentions had prevented them from understanding their father's true wishes. Your father was struggling with balancing fairness too. Margaret against his desire to provide maximum inheritance to his children, Morrison explained. He saw both perspectives as valid and was trying to find a solution that honored both obligations. The irony was devastating. David's death had frozen his estate planning at exactly the moment he was moving toward a more equitable arrangement. His love for his children and his growing recognition of his obligations to me had created a conflict he was actively trying to resolve when he died. Emma looked at me with an expression I had never seen from her vulnerability, mixed with something approaching respect. Margaret, what would make this right? If Dad was planning to change the will, what do you think he would have wanted? It was a question I had been preparing for without realizing it. Over the past weeks, as I had uncovered the truth about David's intentions, I had also been examining my own desires and needs. Your father wanted financial security for all of his family, I replied. He wanted you and Lucas to inherit the substantial assets he had built, but he also wanted to ensure I could maintain my independence and dignity. I think he was trying to find a way to provide both. Over the next 3 hours, we negotiated a revised estate distribution that honored David's evolving intentions. I would receive a larger portion of the liquid assets, enough to purchase a home and provide long-term financial security. Emma and Lucas would inherit the remainder, including most of David's business assets and investments, ensuring their substantial inheritance while acknowledging my 12 years of contribution to the family. More importantly, we established an ongoing relationship structure that recognized our complex family bonds. I wasn't their biological mother, but I had been their stepmother during crucial years of their development. They weren't my biological children, but they were my family in ways that transcended legal documents. 6 months later, I moved into a modest but beautiful home near the water, purchased with my inheritance from David's revised estate. Emma and Lucas visit occasionally, our relationships now built on choice rather than obligation. We share memories of David, discuss their career developments, and slowly build connections based on mutual respect rather than forced family dynamics. The most unexpected development was Morrison's departure from his law firm. 3 months after our confrontation, Emma later told me that several other estate cases had revealed similar ethical lapses in his representation of family interests. Sometimes truth-telling has consequences beyond the immediate situation. I returned to social work part-time, focusing on family mediation and estate counseling. The experience of discovering David's hidden intentions had given me unique insight into how family dynamics can become distorted by money, grief, and miscommunication. My first case involved a widow whose adult stepchildren were contesting their father's will, claiming she had manipulated him in his final years. Having lived through similar accusations in my own mind, I could help her navigate both the legal complexities and the emotional devastation of having her love questioned. Another client was a man whose second wife felt excluded from his estate planning discussions. I encouraged him to involve her in the conversations, sharing how David's attempts to protect me from difficult family dynamics had ultimately hurt me more than including me would have. The work felt like completing a circle, transforming my personal tragedy into professional wisdom that could help other families avoid similar pain. One afternoon, about 8 months after David's death, Emma called with unexpected news. She and Lucas had been discussing the family business assets they had inherited, and they wanted to establish a scholarship fund in David's memory. They asked if I would serve on the selection committee. Dad always said you understood what it meant to work hard for opportunities, Emma explained. We want to support students who are putting themselves through college the way you did, who understand the value of education because they're paying for it themselves. The invitation moved me deeply, not just because it included me in honoring David's memory, but because it showed Emma and Lucas had been paying attention to my background and values. Even when I thought they saw me as peripheral to their family story, the David Chen Memorial Scholarship for first-generation college students became my primary volunteer commitment. Each year, we award 3 scholarships to students studying architecture, social work, or environmental law fields that reflected David's professional passion. my career calling, and Emma's chosen path. During the selection interviews, I often think about David's struggle to balance fairness with family loyalty, his desire to provide security for everyone he loved, and his tragically incomplete journey toward a more equitable solution. The scholarship represents what he might have achieved if he had lived longer away to honor both his biological children and his chosen family, without diminishing either relationship. 2 years after David's death, I received a letter that provided unexpected closure. Morrison's former secretary had left the law firm and wanted to share information she felt I deserved to know. Morrison had indeed been planning to meet with David the week after his death, and the meeting agenda included finalizing a revised will that would have provided me with substantially more financial security. The secretary had seen the draft documents and knew David's true intentions. More significantly, she revealed that Morrison had received a call from Emma on the day after David's funeral, asking him to cancel any pending appointments and proceed with probating the existing will as quickly as possible. Emma had been unaware of David's planned revisions, but her request had effectively prevented any opportunity to discover and implement his final wishes. When I shared this information with Emma, she was devastated. "I thought I was being efficient and helpful," she said through tears. "I had no idea I was preventing Dad from taking care of you the way he wanted to." The knowledge brought both pain and healing. Pain, because it confirmed how close David had come to resolving the ethical dilemma that had been troubling him. Healing, because it proved his love for me had been real and growing, even if circumstances prevented him from fully expressing it. Emma and I talked for hours that day, finally having the honest conversation we had never managed during the years I was married to her father. She told me about feeling protective of her mother's memory, worried that accepting me too completely would somehow betray Catherine. I shared my experience of trying to honor the past while building a future, walking the impossible line between stepmother and outsider. "I wish we had talked like this when Dad was alive," she said as our conversation wound down. "Maybe we could have helped him find a solution that worked for everyone, maybe. Or maybe David's death, terrible as it was, had forced all of us to examine our relationships and motivations in ways we might never have done otherwise. Maybe the family we became after his death, smaller, more honest, built on choice rather than obligation, was something we could only achieve through loss." Looking back now, 3 years later, I realized that Amanda's cruel joke at the Caldwell barbecue had been accidentally prophetic. About David's family, too. When he died, the artificial harmony of our blended family disappeared, revealing the true dynamics underneath. But unlike my experience with the Caldwells, where disappearing led me to discover my own worth, David's death led his family toward greater honesty and more authentic connection. The house I bought with my inheritance sits on a hill overlooking Puget Sound. From my kitchen window, I can see the water change colors throughout the day, sometimes stormy and dramatic, sometimes peaceful and reflective. It reminds me that grief, like weather, has seasons and moods that must be experienced rather than controlled. Emma and Lucas visit for holidays now, not out of obligation, but because we have built something new from the ruins of our original family structure. We talk about David often, sharing memories that keep him present without making him a saint. We argue sometimes, laugh often, and continue learning how to be family to each other in ways that honor both our connections and our differences. The letter David never got to send, the will he never got to revise, the conversation we never got to have about his evolving feelings, these remain unfinished business that will never find complete resolution. But the family we became in the aftermath of his death, the honesty we found through conflict, and the love we chose to maintain despite legal battles and hurt feelings, these represent a different kind of completion. Sometimes the most profound gifts come wrapped in loss, delivered through crisis, and recognized only in retrospect. David's death taught all of us that love isn't just about legal documents or financial provisions. It's about seeing each other clearly, speaking truthfully even when it's difficult, and choosing connection over convenience. The secret that almost destroyed our family ultimately saved it, forcing us to confront assumptions we had never examined and build relationships based on choice, rather than circumstance. In the end, David's greatest legacy wasn't what he left us in his will, it was what he taught us about forgiveness, honesty, and the possibility of redemption even after death. As I sit in my home by the water, surrounded by photos that tell a story of both my marriages, the one that diminished me and the one that challenged me, I understand that disappearing from others' narratives isn't always the answer. Sometimes the answer is refusing to disappear, demanding to be seen clearly. and insisting that love be expressed through action rather than just intention. The folder that fell from my hands in Morrison's office that day scattered more than just papers. Across the conference table, it scattered assumptions about family loyalty, legal obligations, and the difference between what we intend and what we actually accomplish. Picking up those papers meant picking up the pieces of a story that was more complicated, more painful, and ultimately more redemptive than any of us had imagined. David's secret was never really secret, it was simply unfinished. And perhaps the most important thing I learned is that love, like legal documents, is always a work in progress, subject to revision, capable of growth, and most meaningful when it moves beyond good intentions toward concrete action. The challenge wasn't just accepting what David had written in his will. The challenge was discovering what he had intended to write, what he should have written, and what we could write together as a family in the chapters that followed his death. Have you ever discovered that someone you loved had been keeping secrets that completely changed your understanding of your relationship? Sometimes the most painful revelations become the foundation for the most authentic connections. Thanks for watching. Take care. Good luck.